Welcome to the Wellness Law Podcast, where wellness and the law meet for contemplation and collaboration. This podcast is brought to you by the Center for Health and Wellness Law. I am your host, Barbara Zabawa. Welcome, Kim Williams, to the Wellness Law Podcast. I am thrilled to have you here. Everyone, please meet Kim Williams. She founded the Fair Path Project to confront the silent epidemic of workplace bullying and help employees reclaim their dignity at work. She's a veteran HR executive and a survivor of workplace abuse that she witnessed firsthand how workplace culture, gaslighting, and retaliation can harm not only individuals, but the entire organization. And I'm going to link to her Fair Path project at the end of this podcast in the description so you can learn more about Kim and her work. But welcome, Kim.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here.
Oh, I'm thrilled that you are here, and I am learning so much more about you. I understand that you worked for the U.S. government overseas as a diplomat.
Yes,
Can you tell us
yes,
about that?
absolutely. I actually began my career as a U.S. history professor. And so, for anyone thinking about taking the foreign service exam, is basically a U.S. history test, which is why I think a lot of people don't pass it. So, make sure to pay attention in history class for my young friends out there. And then when I went into it expecting to do what they call public diplomacy, which is like working with universities and the press and giving a lot of speeches. And I first started out doing that. But then I was directed into an HR role. And at first I was horrified. I was like, you can't do this to me. I'm a liberal arts major and wasn't sure really what to expect. And within a day of doing it, I just fell madly in love with it because it was the most meaningful work I had ever experienced. It was deeply personal. I was there on the best day of people's lives, on the worst day of people's lives. And so it was just such a joy. It forever changed my career, and I've never wanted to do anything else since.
Wow, you were told to do HR and you fell in love with it. What do you love so much about it?
That it's the most meaningful thing in the world. Our jobs dictate everything. They dictate where we live, where our kids go to school, what type of home we live in. Everything about our life is tied to our job. And which is why I'm also hypersensitive to the fact that if things aren't going well with our job, it can be devastating on so many fronts. It can feel absolutely terrifying, and it's not a small thing when we're dealing with something like being bullied at work.
Yeah. And I think it's important for the audience listening to recognize the link between bullying in the workplace and well being in the workplace because you can't be bullied at work and still feel well. It's just not going to happen. And my understanding is, Kim, that you had some experience with bullying that maybe led you to what you're doing now with the Fair Path Project. Do you want to tell us what happened?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, as an HR chief, I was experiencing workplace abuse by a chief executive. And I was really fortunate. I worked with some really great people in the State Department who were very brave, who were very strong. They didn't care what pay grade somebody was. If there was a problem, they were going to speak truth to power, essentially. And we were actually trained deliberately in that. So I wasn't just trained on HR through the State Department, I was trained on how to manage up, which I think is something that is unfortunately missing from like SHRM and some of these other training programs where everything is geared towards rank and file, but it's completely silent if you've got an executive who's creating an abusive environment or is creating the risk for an organization. And you report up to that person or they sit above you and it's very challenging to navigate. And so I brought some degree of comfort in terms of directly challenging a chief executive who could fire me at any moment. And when I say some degree of comfort, that's probably an overstatement. I was certainly scared out of my mind. I was certainly terrified as a single mother that I was going to get fired, that this was going to ruin my career, that this was going to come with huge consequences. But I also knew the rules deeply and tried to follow them. And what was such a wake up call for me was not only were so many people so afraid to engage with this individuals that board members refused to do anything, inside counsel refused to do anything. And so all the things that I thought I could trust weren't there. And so it was a wake up call for myself. And it was also a wake up call in the sense that if I'm an HR chief and I can't figure this out, what's happening to other people? And so I had to go through a really painful period of making messy steps and working through fear and trying to figure out how to protect myself, document things for myself in an environment where they weren't playing by the rules. And I survived that and did well. And so it became my mission to help as many other people navigate that space as well.
And that leads us to, I think, the Fair Path Project. So this is what you are doing now. Tell us about the Fair Path Project.
Yeah, so it's a unique organization that exists just to deal with workplace bullying. And we primarily focus on executive abuse because I feel like that's where the real gap is. And it's not a small thing. 50 million US workers have been affected by this. And it's always connected to the top. No matter where the abuse comes from, the top of the organization owns that culture. So they're either actively feeding it or they're looking the other way. But what we really have in the system in the US right now is a complete lack of accountability at the top of an organization. And so I really wanted to set out to come up with all the creative ways that exist to build leverage, whether you're an employee or whether you're a person in HR. And I do spend a lot of time focusing on people in HR because I think it's this big, huge secret that HR tolerates a lot of bullying. If you have a toxic environment, that HR shop is not going to be treated well. They're never going to say it out loud. They're going to be the last to talk about it. But if they're advocating for others and things aren't changing, likely they're being punched down at too. And so taking everything I've learned through my hard lessons and providing every type of support I can to folks in HR and then to employees who may not have that support from HR, from the fact that they may be disempowered or not cooperating.
You mentioned that a lot of you're filling the gap with the Fair Path Project is on executive abuse and creating the toxic work environment from the very top of an organization. In your experience working in this space, and how long have you been working in this space? I don't know if we covered that.
Yeah, technically a couple years. And I was a VP of people, culture, and compliance. And I started dipping my toes in these waters, so to speak. I started doing press interviews. I started talking about this. I became really active with an organization called In Workplace Abuse. And this was a volunteer run organization. I just wanted to lend my voice, support legislation, just help in small ways. And it quietly grew until I had two full-time jobs. And then
Oh my God.
6 months ago, I was like, this is my love. This is what I want to do full time. And I jumped out on my own and started building out training and consulting and leverage labs and a number of programs. And it's been a very busy and exciting 6 months since I jumped in there.
Congrats to making that leap. That's a very courageous, and I'm sure it's going to be a very fruitful endeavor. But so getting back to the gap that you're filling, how pervasive is executive abuse, would you say? If you had to attach a percentage to it, what would you say? What percent of companies have an abusive executive, or the leaders in the organization are not, or know about a toxic workplace, but look the other way, as you suggest?
Gosh, I would say the numbers are probably staggering. I haven't done the research to come up with something hard or anecdotal, but I just believe from like a systemic perspective, the fact that there is no accountability in this space naturally breeds high numbers. And the reason why I focus so much on executive abuse is because if a janitor is doing something wrong, they're fired. They lean on the policy, but we have two sets of rules. There's one for the top and one for everybody else. And those at the top write the rules or they will instruct people to bend them. And so there's a leverage there that allows people to protect themselves and avoid accountability that doesn't exist in other places. And over the years, I've spoken to hundreds of CEOs and board members that are like, we know that this person is bad, but we're too afraid to engage them. They'll punch back at us. They hold keys to the kingdom. They're the engineer that we rely on, the boss's brother-in-law, all these different things that are at play. But yeah, in a system with no accountability, I'd say the numbers are high.
Wow. One area that you mentioned that I just find absolutely fascinating from a wellness lawyer perspective is liability insurance. Maybe a board member or others within an organization may be too afraid of approaching the executive, the leaders, and that they're not being held accountable from others within the organization or who are overseeing the organization. But the liability insurers that every organization, responsible organizations anyway,
Yeah.
are contracting with these organizations, they sound like they're starting to hold these leaders and the organizations accountable. Talk about that.
You're exactly right. Yeah, there's some incredible work out there being done by risk managers. There's great organizations like Inclusion Score, Third to First, that are working with insurance underwriters to say, here's some hard data for organizations that withdrew from DEIB, that don't want to look at culture, have higher rates of discrimination claims, have higher rates of harassment claims. And these payouts are becoming nuclear. So juries tend to be more sympathetic to employees than they are to employers. We've seen a massive uptick in the settlement amounts, the jury awards. And so they're making a business case to these underwriters to say, why don't you look at that? Look at organizations that are actually focused on culture and trying to prevent these things and give them lower premiums, and those who don't increase their premiums. And they're getting buy in there. Third to First has been doing some incredible work where they're adding riders to insurance policies. So if an insurance company is saying, okay, company ABC, you have a CEO that keeps sexually harassing women and keep expecting us to write $2 million checks for these massive settlements because of your behavior, what's the remediation plan? Who's getting fired? And they're insisting on accountability. So you're starting to see these fixed costs changes that are really resonating with CFOs. And it's horrible that destroying employees' lives doesn't register, turnover doesn't register, feelings don't register. But when insurance premiums go up, that does register. Or the fact that you won't get insurance at all, and that next check for $2 million you're going to be writing yourself does have more of an impact. And so accountability is definitely coming to this space.
Yeah. So I just want to re-emphasize what you just said because I think it's a really important point. So companies that have a toxic work culture and there've been claims of harassment, sexual harassment or otherwise, the insurers for those companies, the liability insurers, general liability, errors and omissions, they are having to cut checks because of lawsuits brought or just threatening lawsuits, and maybe they have to settle to avoid a lawsuit, and they are increasing the premiums of for these companies that have the toxic workplace. Would a company that did a risk mitigation strategy, like educating their employees about their rights, their legal rights, maybe I don't know, incorporating within their wellness program some more holistic initiatives to try to address the toxic nature of the workplace, could they see a lowering in their premiums?
Absolutely. Hard conversations are free. And it's so much better to address this early on. And I think for a lot of companies out there, like your days of running from that problem are pretty much over. There's people like me who is actively out there. I'm coming up to 100,000 people I've taught how to sue their boss. Younger generations, they're recording you. You're recording yourself with your meeting notes and your AI. And so the ability to collect evidence is easier than ever. The ability to connect with attorneys, the ability to use AI to create timelines and to speak in legal code and to build these cases just only getting stronger by the day. And so for those who are brave enough to engage in the space and say, we're really committed to do the hard thing, even if that hard thing includes a prized executive or some sort of highly valued employee, you're going to be way better off in the long run.
Word to the companies out there who want to do the right thing and reduce their costs
Yeah.
is pay attention to the culture of your organization because it's not just the right thing to do on behalf of your employees, but it also could save you money in
Mhm.
the long run. And of course, Kim, your project is a resource, I assume, for employers, HR individuals, employees to get trained. You talked about leverage labs, and you want to mention that a little bit more and how people might
Yeah.
use those?
So we just hosted our first Leverage Lab in DC in December, and we're planning some smaller events throughout the country and a larger national convening on August 28th. And the idea is to educate more people in deliberate ways. So, like for the national convening, we're going to have 3 tracks set up. One is to bring in employment attorneys from all over the country to become more savvy in how to go after attorneys when there's not a slam dunk discrimination or harassment claim. For example, in Texas, we see a lot of breach of contract claims. So if an employer has a handbook that says, we do not tolerate bullying, if someone brings us a complaint, we will investigate immediately, and they don't, we're seeing lawsuits based on that. And so there are a million other ways to go after an employer besides some of the more traditional ones. And the Fair Path Project is really keen on becoming a research hub for all the creative things that we're seeing employment attorneys do across the country, and then sharing that out so that more attorneys are able to help more people. We're also working on connecting folks that show up at the Fair Path Project in workplace abuse, some other great organizations that need help, to connect them with great attorneys that we know exist in their area, and it would be able to help them specifically with bullying claims. We're working with businesses to talk about there's a really hard dollar cost on keeping that brilliant juror. And we're going to help you figure out exactly how much that is, because you can take that salary data and you can look at performance, engagement, and see if somebody's getting screamed at all day, they're not giving you a return on investment for that salary. They're probably giving you 30% at best of what you're paying them. And when you turn that and you start quantifying that and speaking a different language, and instead of saying, oh, that person's really hurting people, to that person just cost you $250,000 in lost productivity, it's changing the way that they're thinking about that and changing the incentive to begin addressing the problems. And then we also make those risks more real for them by saying these are the things that are here. And it opens the door to talk about what's really going on, which 9 times out of 10 is just fear. And so we do a lot of private coaching with executives who are saying, like, I know we've got a nightmare here. And so we help them come up with strategies to say, okay, let's start building around that. Let's start diminishing that power little bit by little bit. And what are the keys to the kingdom that they hold? No organization should have a single point of failure to begin with. So how can we start recruiting for some things? How can we start training other individuals? How can we start setting it up so you can safely separate yourself from this person and not have the liability that they're now bringing to the equation? And then I've also started specific training for HR pros because they quietly absorb enormous amounts of abuse. And so I also help them speak in risk kind of mitigation framework language so that they are also showing up in ways that say, okay, you're trying to bully that person out of the job. Okay, we can terminate them. Here's how much this is going to cost you. This is what the lawsuit's going to look like. And so we're changing their language. We're changing their leverage. We're teaching them how to own more power in the same way diplomats are trained, so that they can show up and advocate for others and advocate for themselves safely.
I love that. You're creating agency, and I just absolutely love that. Kudos to all the work that you're doing, Kim, through the Fair Path Project. How can people learn more about the Fair Path Project and you and your work?
Yeah, we're at fairpathproject.com. So we seek to be a resource for anyone. There's contact forms where you can reach out to us and we'll get right back to you. We have a team of people who are always on standby to help. And then we're building out more and more training programs throughout the year. We'll be posting more leverage labs if you'd like to join an event in your area. And then, of course, on LinkedIn, Kimberly E. Williams. I'm pretty active. I'm always sharing advice there. I'm always happy to connect with folks if you want to DM me through that. If you have special things you need help with, we're always here and always happy to put people in touch with resources.
Wonderful. I'll make sure I link to those in the description. And I want to thank you again for sharing your time and your vision with us today, Kim.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Wellness Law Podcast. You can find more wellness law resources by visiting the Center for Health and Wellness Law website at www.wellnesslaw.com, where you can also subscribe to our newsletter and follow us on social media. Until the next episode, stay well, stay hopeful, and stay legal.